Welcome to the Awakening Shalom podcast. The Awakening Shalom podcast is an opportunity for digital faith formation at Myers Park Baptist Church that accompanies the Awakening series, a year-long journey of exploration and discernment which invites all people to come learn about the current social justice issues of the day and how they impact our faith. What we are awakening to is Shalom, the Hebrew word for the peace and beauty that exists when we are living in right relationship with God, ourselves, other human beings, and all created things.
Welcome back to our podcast series, Theo-Political Creativity, Race, Faith, and Politics. We are so excited to be back for episode 2 and to get deeper into this work. And we also have a special guest who we will introduce in a few moments. Ben, I just wanted to pick up, because last time you were wearing your Baldwin 2020 shirt, and we were talking in the last episode about how I was a part of a faith tradition where Black preachers run for office very often, so there really isn't a separation between faith and politics. So I wanted to bring my shirt from 2014. My pastor in Harlem was running for a seat in the 13th Congressional District. And so I wanted people, especially at our congregation, to really see how interwoven this culture is. I mean, we were wearing these shirts, not really on Sunday morning, though some people did, but we were wearing these shirts and canvassing, and it wasn't really about believing our pastor was the best candidate because he was our pastor. But I mean, if you actually watch the debates of the other two men that were running against him, he was clearly the most imaginative, the most creative, which is in line with what we're talking about on this podcast series. And so it's very much interwoven. Very much. So I wanted to bring my shirt. I didn't wear it.
I love seeing it. Yeah, I mean it's a reminder, right, for the white community, folks from the white church tradition, that we try to create these like really separate categories and compartmentalize things in areas to try to like keep them safe. We do that in a lot of ways, not just intellectually, but in urban planning, all kinds of different things. So and the world is so much more complex than that, and so much more interwoven, and more and these neat boundaries and tidy little compartments and boxes that we create actually don't work or serve us or anybody else. And so just kind of wrestling with that, because of the history, we don't have muscle memory on leaning into the complexity and the intertangling of sort of church and pastors running for political office in the same way in sort of the mainline tradition that we see, mainline white tradition as we see in the Black community. So I love that, and it's an important reminder, like we did last week, about social location, right? Everything starts with that.
Yeah. So I wanted to drop that in there, and it was a moment in time, but certainly something that I'm glad to have been a part of. And so we're going to open with our quote, as we do every episode. Today's quote is from a book called Theo-Political Imagination, Christian Practices of Space and Time by William T. Cavanaugh. And I want to say a little bit about some of the concepts in it. I have not read it in its entirety, but William Cavanaugh deals with the myth of the state as savior, so that some kind of way the state will save us. And he also deals with the myth of civil society as free space. So if society is civil, if we could just have civility, then everybody will be free. And that is not true. So he's wrestling with these two myths that I've come across so far. So the quote is from page 90, I believe, in the book. And it says, "We must cease to think that the only choices open to the church are either to withdraw into the private or sectarian confinement, or to embrace the public debate policed by the state. We must cease to think that the only choices open to the church are either to withdraw into the private or sectarian confinement, or to embrace the public debate policed by the state." I thought that this was timely given this week's events. that I still have not watched in its entirety because I don't have the nerves. But
Don't do it. It ain't worth it.
yeah. So I just want to drop that out there as we enter into conversation. We have a special guest today. I am super excited to hear from Minister Candace Simpson. Candace, can you introduce yourself for the people?
Greetings and salutations, Earthlings. I am Minister Candace Simpson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in all the way from Brooklyn, New York, which is the best small, big town in the whole world. It just is what it is. I am an associate minister at the Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm so excited to be here with my seminary classmate, the Reverend Mia. And it's just so good to be with you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Candace, for joining us. Yesterday, when we were recording episode 1, Ben and I started the conversation by talking about our social location as it relates to this combo of faith and public policy and politics. So can you give the people a little bit of detail about how you are entering the conversation today, particularly in this political moment we are in right now?
So it's funny because Girlfriends was just released on Netflix, like maybe a few weeks ago. And what I love about watching media from like 20 years ago at this point, 15 years ago, is allowing myself to be surprised that some things are just the same. And I will be 30 in January, so I have not seen as many years as others have. I find myself around elders who remind me that the world has always looked like this, that there has always been trouble all over this world, and certainly this is a strange iteration of the evil that our ancestors and our elders have witnessed. But I was watching Girlfriends, and one of the characters said something to the effect of, "Oh, well, they steal elections." And I said to myself, oh yeah, that's right, because remember 2000? Remember that whole Florida recount? That was a moment. And so when we talk about political moments, I have to remind myself that the things that we're seeing are not new things. They're, as Adrienne Marie Brown would say, things are getting uncovered. It's not the end of the world. It is an unveiling, something that we're witnessing that, quite frankly, many people have warned us about, and many people have tried to focus our gaze towards. So when I think about the phrase political moment, I'm like, well, which one? Do we mean the last 4 years under this particular president? Do we mean the last presidency, which is the one where the movement for Black Lives was birthed? Do we mean Bush? Do we mean Clinton? Do we mean, who are we talking about? So that's what I'm thinking of, as I'm also trying not to get numb and completely disinterested and even, what's the word? Apathetic. So
Yeah.
holding all that.
I thank you for forcing clarification, because when I said political moment, I don't even know what I'm talking about. So, right, because I'm thinking this particular election, but this particular election is just a drop in a bucket of centuries of turmoil in communities. I'm not sure what would you define as the political moment? Because I lacked clarity there.
I love the way that Candace is teaching through her language not to say things like worst time and worst ever or new or fresh. I love that phrase, what fresh hell is this? But it's there's nothing fresh about it, right? It's very stale. It's dated. It's an unveiling. It's an uncovering. That language is so helpful because there's no where to go back to find a pure moment of justice or even conciliation of any kind. All there is empire building, and there is a long history, of course, of oppression, many different kinds of intersecting oppression. And while there has been a counter revolution, a movement for democracy and for freedom and for rights and for liberation, it's the blowback is constant, and the evil that we face continues to transform itself into new iterations constantly. And if we're not paying attention to that historical truth, we will miss how it's being reborn as another evil in the present, or what has already been there always, that's being unveiled, to Candace's point, that we then have to go back and reckon that we did not liberate ourselves from this before, and now we face it again because we thought we could do a surface level change. We keep kind of saying, if we just prune the tree, we can fix the tree or get the tree to grow into something healthy. But the roots, right, are the problem. And so I think it's our desire as human beings to want to continue to live in denial. And so we keep going into denial and we forget about the history. We're very forgetful. So we forget about the history, and then we suffer the same problem again.
Yeah. Thank you for that reflection. Candace, so in terms of your experiences in church, what role has the church, your experience with church, played in politics? I'm curious about your background in that. As Ben and I shared in the previous episode, Ben came from a tradition that even, the ballots were handed to him completed. In one of your church contexts, the ballots were handed to you and who you were supposed to vote for. I came from a tradition where we had people running for office speaking on Sunday morning. That was a part of our culture. There was no separation. So I'm curious about church and politics in your past and present traditions.
So that iconic photo of Shirley Chisholm announcing her candidacy for President of the United States actually was taken in the Fellowship Hall, Memorial Hall at Concord Baptist Church of Christ. And I've listened to people talk about like what that moment meant. I mean, of course, when things get cemented in history, we do tend to glamorize and, kind of fawn over the past. But when I think of like church and politics, that's the first image that I have in my mind. And I think it's significant that in a church, in a Black church that is like so many other Black churches, supported by the work of and the dreaming of Black women, that this Black woman would announce her presidency here. And it matters that it's this particular candidate. So Shirley Chisholm was endorsed by the Black Panthers, and everyone told her, oh no, you might want to distance yourself. This is not, and she refused to distance herself politically from that community, which says a lot. I mean, it says a lot about her integrity and who she was just as a community leader. If you ask people of a certain generation in Bed-Stuy, they have fond memories of what it is, what it meant to have someone like her. And of course, like all politicians, people have critiques, as they should, because politicians are not gods. And even our gods deserve a little side eye occasionally, because sometimes I don't know what they are on. So that's the first image that I think of. But I think I have a hard time locating and situating all of my excitement about politics within electoral politics. So, of course, that's like the first image that I think of. But when I think about like Black church and politics, I also think about spiritual care and nourishment and community building as a political need, as something that is, it is absolutely spiritual and community based, but it also is a political project. I think Black people deciding to get together and worship is a political statement. And I think the ways that the kinds of God, the kind of images of God that we imagine, the kind of, the ways we talk to and about God is a political project. You know, when we talk about, you know, has he ever made a way when he didn't have a dime? Has he ever stepped in just right on time? You know, like, has he ever picked you up when you are down? Has he ever placed your feet on solid ground? Then you know he is a rock in a weary land. You know, this is about Christ. And it's also about our community, like other Black people. It's about how we experience salvation through really intimate relationships, such that, you know, towards the beginning of the pandemic, I was really in a funk. And I got a text message from one of the deacons at the church, and she said, "What you doing?" And I said, "I'm obviously in my house." And she said, "Well, come outside." And she just came by to wave at me, which really made a difference in that day, in that week, in that season. To be remembered by somebody else made me want to remember somebody else. And I think that's what churches at our best can do. We can remind people that they're not forgotten, that they're not disposable, that they're not trash like the world has told them and us that we are. So I think that's what I think of when I'm thinking of Black church and politics.
Yeah. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sure, I had no idea. So that Shirley Chisholm made that announcement there. So that was news to me. And certainly, I don't know if Ben wants to riff here, but we've had conversations about people's tension with our engagement with politics. We had somebody as a guest speaker last week who we didn't even have as a political candidate, but they're running for office. We just had them as an activist and an author, and there was some tension there because they are running for office. And I know that that's part of working in our particular church context and to respect that. But it's so interesting to hear that it's just such a normal thing to have somebody come and be like, "Yeah, I'm running for president and I'm making my announcement in the fellowship hall."
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the thing that, first of all, that's fascinating. The Shirley Chisholm story is incredible, and how that's like one of a foundational memory for you, and how different that is for a lot of folks in our tradition, or my tradition. But the thing that really just kind of blew me away about what you were saying, Candice, is how you described pastoral caregiving and worship as political activities. And I just this week had somebody on a phone call try to kind of say to me, "Well, we were really hoping that during this pandemic, you would be more pastoral and less political, or less prophetic," they said, or that the balance would be better. There would be more balance of the pastoral with the prophetic. And yeah, I see there's some side eye to those, to the gods of separation, right? Like why? How is it that we got to a place where we think pastoral caregiving and prophetic preaching or pastoral preaching are different? Or, you know, how did we get there? What is that about? What does that mean that they think worship is not a political activity? What is it? What is it then? What are we doing then? What is it? A country club? Is it what are we doing if it's not political? You know, and so there's this limited imagination, and a narrow view, and maybe this is something unique to the white tradition, or specific, and especially in the white sort of main line, and we called it the purple church tradition yesterday, also. And but it's very frustrating to try to lead people. Even I'll use the language of pastor people who have compartmentalized prophetic and pastoral activity, separating them distinctly from one another, and critiquing their clergy for engaging in one more than the other, and giving us like a scale in which we have to balance whatever they mean by pastoral with whatever they mean by prophetic on some kind of scale. So I love how you said that a pastoral is political. That's powerful to me. Yeah. Sorry, Mia.
I would even say that it's not just the white mainline church, but I've heard similar sentiments from certain Black churches. We call them high, I don't know what Candace calls them, but I call them high Baptist or the high tradition, who are also critiquing their Black pastors who are being very political in their preaching right now. And certainly that's a form of assimilating to whiteness, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but I've heard that as well from a few Black ministers who work in these types of churches as well. I'm not sure if Candace has heard anything similar.
I mean, I think this is a project of, as leaders, and we are all leaders. So there are lay leaders, and then there are religious professionals who are like pastors and in other capacities. I think it's a project in hearing feedback and really listening to the heart of what people are saying. So I think if someone were to say, "Oh, I wish you weren't so political," I think the response ought to be a question, which is, what does that mean to you? What is it? What rubs you raw? What about the sermon or my Facebook post felt too political? I think sometimes people I don't know that we are always able to articulate like what's really irritating us. Sometimes people just don't want to be in church on Sunday and hear statistics or even hear anything about that man in the White House. Sometimes people come to church and they want to escape. And I think that's valid. I think that is a human look. I didn't watch the debates on Monday or whatever day that was because I couldn't. I'm like, I'm not doing it. I don't want to engage. I don't want to think about it. But that doesn't mean that because I didn't participate in that activity, that I've bowed out of political engagement. It means that I choose to do this work in a different kind of way. Like, I think we all have to acknowledge our boundaries and what we can and cannot hear. Now, of course, some people, they will say things like, I want to hear this social justice stuff, rah, 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 And so I think strategically what our task, our challenge is then to find where in the Bible can we express the kernel of that political thing that we're trying to point to, so that, sometimes you gotta be subversive. I think that was part of, there's so much wisdom in the Bible, but I think what draws me to Christ is that man was a master pedagogue and could talk about trees and fish and flowers and lilies and things like that in a way that opened up curiosity, because we're still talking about these parables like thousands of years later. And I think perhaps the worst thing that happened to our faith is just the binaries of like flesh and spirit and male and female and, all these things that we imagine are opposite and against each other. And that's just something that we're now we're dealing with the consequences of that. I mean, I think about someone like Cardi B, who, along with Megan Thee Stallion, has like a top selling song, and people are like, "Oh, how can she sing that? Because she's a mother." And I was like, well, exactly. She's a mother. Like, how you think people become mothers? Like, like what? You know, but we have a hard time seeing people do two things at once. You know, so people could not take seeing her post pictures of her daughter and then also promote this album. Like, and so we just have a hard time holding all of these parts of ourselves together. And that's for real, for real. White supremacy has taught us to do that. And it's taught us to be skeptical of those places within us where all of these things meet. We're so afraid of being more than just pastoral or prophetic. So we can be all the things.
We can be all the things in Christ who strengthens us. Candace, I want to get into some of your work. And I will preface this by saying that lately on social media, I've been seeing a lot of people talking about abolition. And some people know what they're talking about, and some people don't. And it's very clear who has done the reading and who hasn't. And so I invited you because I feel like you've done the reading. And I would like, as somebody who is still learning and who has not done all the reading, and so I can't talk fully about it, I want to hear about your understanding of abolition as it relates to this conversation of faith and politics. What is the vision that you and others are calling us toward?
I think, well, first, I think it's important to say that, like, even people who do the reading are still doing the reading. Like, and I think that's something that when I'm in space with abolitionists who've taught me, like, and who I consistently learn from, the most beautiful thing about being in that community is that people are asking questions and being reflective and even, you know, modeling a posture of self-critique, which is, dang, I used to think this and I don't think that anymore. I can't believe I used to be. I mean, and you hear this consistently, like, questioning of where we are and how we got here, and like the possibilities are endless. When I think of abolition, I think it is my only choice. I think it's our only choice. And you know, as you've said, it's a hot topic lately, and it's also something that is oh, Jesus. It's something that is stirring up a lot of dust, and it's, if I could be frank, it's putting people in danger because I think what we're saying often gets maligned. Like, I think what we're saying is intentionally misunderstood, intentionally misconstrued, because, you know, haters gonna hate, potatoes gonna potate. So, but yeah, I remember a time in my life, and it wasn't that long ago, where I believed in reform. I believed in prison reform. I believed in police training and accountability, and, you know, I thought that we could train our ways out of this. And I've watched enough and I've seen enough people become hashtags to know that even in the places where we have instituted these reforms, even in the places where we have body cameras, even in the places where people have done the bias training, they've done the implicit, you know, bias conversations and the professional development, people are still being killed. The chokehold in New York has been illegal. And at some point we have to ask, what is this demon that forces and encourages people to view Black people, and particular Black people, as something to be exterminated, like vermin? I mean, this is a spiritual issue. It's not something that can be, book clubbed away. Even though I believe in a good political education session, I think there are just some things that have to be exorcised. Like, and there are some demons that we have been playing with. And when you track the history of modern policing, it is through slave patrols. And I think at this stage of my life, my concern about abolition, and this is something I've been working through with others, is like, well, what happens if when we get to the place where we have defunded the police and we've disbanded these police departments? What happens then when wealthy white folks decide to invest in private security? And what happens when they buy, excess weapons from the military? What happens when people, at some point, this is what I'm saying about, like, we have to keep digging and keep thinking about what else is possible. And that's not to say that, like, I don't want to defund the police. I do. But I think we also have to consider that this is powers and principalities. And at some point, we are going to have to sit with just how evil this world can be. And so when I had heard this word abolition since I was a child, and I think in the last 5 years is when I heard the word abolition around police and prisons. When I had first heard abolition, of course, I was thinking and was taught about the institution of slavery and really the founding of this nation. And I thought, I've learned about abolitionists and famous abolitionists, Emancipation Proclamation, whatever that did, And so one of our pastors at Concord, Leonard Black, was a formerly enslaved person who freed himself and ran away. And he was at Concord for maybe 2 years or so, and he had to just dip, he had to escape because the Fugitive Slave Law was enacted, the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted. And even as pastor of the Concord Baptist Church at this time, he was in danger. And so he had to flee again to Canada. And when I think of that inheritance, when I think of that legacy, when I think of what's in our institutional DNA, I don't think there's any other choice but abolition. Our ancestors, they had no choice. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's not theory. It's not, something in the sky. This is survival. And so I just don't know how to live in a world that makes space for treating entire classes of humans as disposable, as, disappearable, and that's it's a spiritual idea. It is, once you have decided that someone is not deserving of the freedoms that you enjoy, you've unlocked a dimension around once you allow that, then I do think a part of you becomes dehumanized. I think you lose a part of your humanity, and I think I don't know, it's gonna take more than prayer. It's gonna take a little book list.
Wow. Thank you, Candace. I want to see if I can jump in here on this one. So as a person who sits at a social location and an ancestry of people who have dehumanized themselves and then dehumanized others, one of the things that I have been coming to wrestle with is that one of the demons that we like to play with, to use your language, that needs to be exercised is whiteness itself, and so lots of theologians describe it as a principality or a power that has to be exercised, or you could even say abolished. Although you don't hear a lot of people talking about abolishing whiteness, or at least I don't hear a lot of people talking about abolishing whiteness.
Oh, we're talking about it.
Okay, good. Oh yeah, hush harbors and other things where some folks are not present. Yeah. So that's great. So maybe that's a good segue then into what is the conversation about that, and what does it look like for people racialized as white to participate in the abolishing of their their own of the thing that they participate in and benefit from, and what does that look like?
I was just having this conversation with my mom the other night because abolition is a constant curiosity. And so the abolitionists ask, well, how can we fill in the blank? So if, for example, we notice that a lot of children are being picked up by police officers at a certain time, then the abolitionist says, why are these children being targeted at this time? And what can we create instead to keep them out of the system? And I think, that's why after-school programs matter. That's why sports, music, other, community-based activities matter. And that's the everydayness, as Emily Towns would say, the everydayness of resistance. And so for white folks, I think it's just too easy to fall out of the everydayness. And so earlier this summer, now this is, you want to talk about abolishing things, we also need to really reflect on who we riot for and who we rage for. People have forgotten Tony McDade's name, who was a Black trans man killed by police, but they have not forgotten George Floyd. And in some other ways, we've not forgotten Breonna Taylor, but part of that is because people are making memes out of her, and we can come back to that conversation maybe later. But I remember, earlier in the summer, there were all these stories of Black people being killed by police, and white people just had the space to be sad about it and pretend to be outraged, pretend to be shocked, pretend to be, oh my gosh, I can't believe, I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from well-meaning white folks who were like, what do you need? How can I support you? How can I? And they went unanswered because, again, this is not new. Things are just being uncovered. We are seeing things, and it's new to you, but it's not new to us. And so I think part of that is to resist the surprise and the shock and the awe. That's something that white people get to do. And so this happens almost like quarterly, where like hyper visible Black women and like certain kinds of Black women get an uptick in PayPal, unsolicited PayPal donations, because white people realize this quarter, oh my gosh, racism exists. And so instead of putting these anti-racist, whatever that means, practices and postures, into real life at your day job, you sending people $25 here and there, like that has fixed something. Now I'm gonna get my nails done, so thank you. But I think we should interrogate like why is it possible for you to do away with $25 and think nothing of it? You know, like what is it, because you've got more $25, where that comes from, right? And where did that come from? And I don't think we're having those conversations. Well, that's a big word. I don't think white people are really interrogating the fluidity, the casualness, the ease of popping in and out of these cycles of grief. So I would love to live in a world where whiteness does not exist. And I would love to see how that comes about. There are places where it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
At least not how it exists here. But then again, even in those places, there's colonization.
Yeah.
And there's power struggles, and there's caste struggles. And like, so even where white people are not present, there's still this underlying battle of power, which, you know, as someone who's from the States, I see that as a white thing. It's a white logic. It is a white way to exist in the world. So the white saints gonna have to get in that prayer closet and really talk to their Jesus. Well, maybe not to their Jesus. They might need to.
Not that white Jesus.
You might need to find a new Jesus.
There's a book on that. Who wrote the book? Was it Jacqueline Grant, who said Black women's Christ and white women's Jesus? Am I mistitling that? Yeah. Wow.
So I was thinking about, for, you know, how white folks, do they have ancestors to draw on, right? You know, that is the struggle, to identify people who have embodied, you know, justice and truth and critique of the system and lived it in their lived reality. Finding true saints is a challenge. That's a challenge.
Well, and I think I always get really like freaked out when white people start calling on their ancestors, because I'm like, hold up, do not bring them into this room. They need to register and come through a screening process. You know, whenever we have like, you know, gatherings, people are like, oh, my aunt. I'm like, ooh, hold on. But I think when I humble myself and I really think about the places in my life where I have power, the places in my life where I have cushions, and one of those places is my faith. Of course, Black Christians get treated differently than white Christians and other kinds of Christians, but I still have privilege, and there are powers that come with identifying as a Christian. And so I do, when you talk about, like, you know, our ancestors who we probably should not bring into the room, I think about people in our holy text who we got some examples of some trifling people, and but I think the faith and the project of the faith is not to put people on pedestals or to try to sanitize their legacy, but to really confront the activities of their hands and their hearts, and to see what they did, and to really look in the mirror and say, is this who we want to be? Like, you know, I think that is the beauty of the Bible. And as a Black queer woman, I have every right to not open that book because of the ways that it has been used as a weapon against me and people that I love. And I think the power of a common text like a Bible is that we get to, as a community, later on discern, all right, this King Nebuchadnezzar, are we going to do this again or are we not going to do this again? All right, like Pontius Pilate, this guy is in this story. Are we going to do this again or are we not going to do this again? Like, even, you know, some of the disciples and some of the writers of the letters, I mean, we get to say to these words, this part is good, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. Like, we get to have a discernment. And I think we, you know, get to look at our theological ancestors and ask those questions. And I think white people get to ask that question of their ancestors, and to say, this is what has been done in my name, and I need to sit with that. I need to feel whatever feelings I have. I need to process that, and hopefully not like with Black folks, because we are not spiritual mammies and wet nurses. And I think that happens a lot. Like a lot of white people will confess to Black people. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this information? Like, okay, right? Like, but that's also spiritual work, is confronting those people in our bloodline, whether it's real or spiritual or, you know, fictive, and to really sit with what is in us, and are we gonna be those kinds of people in this world?
You said King Nebuchadnezzar, and Ben has preached like 17 sermons on Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, I'm exaggerating, more like 4, but
I do have to mention that I love the fact that this one thing about the Bible, how the Hebrew people change his name by changing one letter, and call him, you know, preserve my jackass is what it really means when they say it. And so that's what I say now about, you know, certain other Nebuchadnezzars in this world. You know, it's like, this is a jackass. This is what we call it. This is what the people, they knew it. They wrote it into their sacred text when they described this person. And it was subversive, to your point earlier. They found a way to change one letter and as a powerful act of critique and political resistance. I love it.
Political resistance, though, the fact that people can say that politics don't belong in church, but we're having this conversation, and in the sacred text, we're seeing these people calling a politician essentially a jackass. This is not new. You know, this is, I don't know. I mean, we know what happened and how things kind of got entangled and disentangled, but this is not a new thing to be having a political critique coming from people of faith. Yeah.
No.
So Candace, you mentioned the sacred text, and as we begin to wrap up, we close each of these episodes with theological imagination. And so I'm curious about, Ben, and you can jump in here too. I talked about my text last time, so I won't do much this time, but I'm curious about what sacred text inspire your leaning into of the abolitionist movement, the nouveau, or whatever we want to call it. I think of Leviticus 25, but I'm curious about what you lean on if you had to get explicitly spiritual or theological with people.
How much time we got? Because you know I love to play in the Bible. So so one of my favorite texts, and it always says something different to me every time I read it, is the widow in 2 Kings 4. And it's the story of this woman whose children are about to be sold into debt slavery. And so the prophet tells her to go next door to all of her neighbors and collect containers. So she goes next door to collect the containers. And the prophet tells her, all right, now close the door and begin to pour from your own oil container into these other containers that you've borrowed. And when in my imagination, like I think about the relationships that are kind of implied, because I don't let people borrow my Tupperware. So, because sometimes you're just not gonna get it back. And so the fact that all these people lent this woman her, their containers is already an indication about the strength of the relationship that they had. At least that's my take on it. And so she goes, she closes the door and she's pouring into all of the containers. And by some miracle, the oil keeps flowing from container to container to container. Of course, with the hope that she would take this oil and then sell it so that she could get herself out of this really exploitative predicament. And what I love about that text is it's such a, like, this is a real circumstance. Like, there are actual widows. There are actual people who are widows. Like, this is not like a metaphor for something. And in a patriarchal society and in a capitalist society, these are very vulnerable people. And politically, economically, spiritually, otherwise, these are very vulnerable people. And she got kids. And she's able to go from house to house and get these containers. And what I love about this story is that it's such an organic and such a familiar image of, in my imagination, this is a Black mama who's going from door to door and doing what she got to do for her children. And I think sometimes when people speak about abolition, again, like, abolitionists have been, people say, oh, you do so much theory and, the people in the hood don't get it. But people do get it. People do know what it's like to share resources, to do mutual aid, to watch each other's kids, to create pods of accountability. I mean, before Miss Rona, we were doing that. And in neighborhoods that are being gentrified and colonized, that strength, that strong community tie is being dissolved. And so abolition in that story, I like that story centers this woman and her children, and it doesn't appeal to the power systems that already exist. And so there may be a time, like I said, where we don't have police and we don't have prisons. And until that time, we still have to create a culture of community, and create a culture of supporting and loving and protecting and looking out for each other, because the state is not going to do it. I mean, I understood and I understand the significance of the communal mourning that people are doing around the passing of Justice Bader Ginsburg. I absolutely think it makes sense that people are sad. And it also makes sense that people are angry about the potential replacement. And before things get to the Supreme Court, they have to be enacted in everyday interactions. And so before they get there, it's the way that you and I treat each other, the way that I choose to evict you in a pandemic, or the way that I choose to hire someone else because it's easier for me to have this person in the office than someone else. Or, I mean, you can't legislate humanity. It's an important thing. I mean, we need, clearly, there are things that the Supreme Court has allowed for me as a Black queer woman to do. And when I think about that story of this woman and, going door to door, you got to do what you got to do. Like, we got to take care of each other and just pretend like the state is never going to catch up. Just pretend like pretend like you can't count on them. And I think that's why full circles, we're talking about this political moment. I'm not despairing, at least not today. Maybe, you know, later on I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I won't be able to fall back asleep, but I don't believe that this nation will take care of us. I'm not hopeful about it, but I do believe that we can take care of each other. And that's where I put my attention. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness and mutual aid, period.
Yes, indeed. This communal salvation thing that I am obsessed with. But after reading Monica Coleman's work, and that's a huge part of what she talks about in her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, which is also full circle because you were quoting that song from earlier, but she lingers on the mutual aid piece, the communal salvation. Thank you for that. Thank you for that theological imagination. Ben, do you have any reflections on that?
My mind is blown right now, so I'm I'm still thinking about the exegesis and the sermon we just heard, and I think the thing that really strikes me and kind of hits me to my core is how in my particular education on this topic, I was taught a way of thinking like this that sounds like this, but is not like this. And it was through the lens of sort of Hauerwasian ethics, where I was taught that, you know, no, we're not partisan, we're not political. The church as itself, the church itself is the politics, but there is a danger in that because it only mirrors and reflects without deep enough critique what Candace is dropping on us right now about communal salvation and how we really only have each other to rely on, our people. And if we look to the state to save us, you know, Hauerwas also points out that mistake. But then the answer is the church. And there's another corrective that's needed into saying that the church is not always the community of God. Right? And sometimes the community of God is that neighborhood around the widow, right? And clearly some of Candace's community and our friendship relationships, who care for us, who are our family, true family, not the family we made, not the family that we've been given. And what does it mean to build a community, church or not church, right? That cares for one another in the way that is shown and revealed in the story that Candace exegeted for us, and in the way that poor communities have often found ways to care for one another, and marginalized and oppressed communities have often taken care of one another through an imaginative economy that is the alternative to the neoliberal economic world that we're in right now. And so, I don't know, I just think that that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And just one last thing, too many of our hopes, I love the fact that both of y'all were like, I didn't even watch the election, or watch the debates, because everybody that I know, almost everybody in our church was like on the floor for the next 24 hours and like could not move from it and it's not because there's nothing at stake. No, everything's at stake, but because their hope is in the wrong place.
All right.
So I'm singing that hymn too, Candace. I'm try to not make it sound like, you know, a white hymn, you know, but I'm singing it internally because I don't sing out loud.
Yes, the hope is in the wrong place. And guess what? It's not just white folk who are troubled and on the floor. It's been very surprising to see some non-white folk be troubled constantly constantly in turmoil and on the floor about this. But I would love to close by just reflecting on what Candace shared about the state. It's not going to save us, we save us. And so what does hope look like now in this moment, trademark, in this moment of socioeconomic, political turmoil, whatever we want to call it, that is not in whoever the replacement is on the Supreme Court. It's not in whoever the new president or same old president is going to be. It is in us. We are the ones. So, Candace, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing with us. I am so glad that I was finally able to get you on the show, on the podcast.
I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that we're having these conversations, not as like, you know, an intellectual exercise, but really to like be accountable to this call that is on our lives to imagine something otherwise. And so this is really exciting. I think the wisdom that's on my heart is from Bishop Pinky in the Brain. And so Pinky in the Brain, you know, like every day they would try and take over the world, and they would fail every day, and they would lose every day. And these plans were so harebrained and ridiculous. And Brain would say to Pinky, no, we're gonna do tomorrow. Or no, Pinky would say to the Brain, so what are we gonna do tomorrow night, Pinky? Or what are we gonna do tomorrow night, Brain? And Brain says, same thing we do every night, try to take over the world. So it's exhausting. I'm tired. I'm not gonna lie to you, like your girl is stressed. But we're gonna take over the world like we do every night.
Yeah.
And so we have to fortify ourselves. I'm sorry to hear that people were slain for 24 hours post watching this debate. But we really do have to fortify ourselves and make decisions about our wellness, because there are some spiritual attacks that are on their way and already here, trying to make us as inefficient as possible so that we don't do the work that God is calling us to do.
Woo. The Holy Spirit is moving, Candace, because why, Ben? What were we just talking about yesterday?
I was totally quoting Pinky in the Brain to Mia yesterday. See how the Spirit is working? And I have a Pinky impression. Do you want to hear my Pinky impression?
Yes.
Hey, Brian, what we going to do tonight? What we going to do tonight, Brian? Hey, Brian, what we going to do tonight? Same thing we do every night. Try and take over the world. That's it.
And on that woo, thank y'all for joining us. And we're going to wrap that episode.
You have to have joy.